Professor Zylken adjusted his forearms nervously as he entered the grand auditorium of Galactic University. His purple skin shimmered under the bright lights, and his three eyes scanned the impressive crowd before him. Today was going to be special. Oh yes, very special indeed. The auditorium buzzed with excitement. In the front row sat Morden, the towering representative from the crystalloid empire, his diamond-like skin refracting rainbow patterns across the walls. Behind him, Moran from the Hive Collective clicked her mandibles impatiently, her compound eyes glittering with curiosity. Admiral Vashi had taken a seat near the middle, his tentacles coiled elegantly around his chair, while Admiral Drohorn's massive frame dominated an entire section designed for his rock-like species. Esteemed colleagues, fellow researchers, and distinguished members of the Galactic Academic Council, Zylken began, his voice carrying that particular tone of academic superiority that only tenured professors could perfect. I am Professor Zylken, and for the past 2 centuries I have dedicated my life to studying primitive species across our galaxy. A few polite clicks and chirps echoed through the audience. Commander Tom Mali, sitting with the military delegation, leaned forward slightly, his scaled face showing mild interest. Today, Zylken continued, pausing dramatically as his middle eye focused on the crowd, I present to you research that will fundamentally change how we view one particular species that has recently made contact with our Galactic Council. Judge Quintara's horn-like protrusions twitched with anticipation. Several audience members shifted in their specially designed seats. Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary consciousness entities, Zylken said, his voice dropping to what he clearly thought was an ominous whisper, I am here to tell you that humans, those adorable pink, bipedal creatures from the third planet of Sol system, are actually the most dangerous apex predators this galaxy has ever seen. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the auditorium exploded with laughter. Morden's crystal body chimed like wind bells as he shook with amusement. Moran's clicking became rapid-fire staccato bursts of hilarity. Even the normally stoic Admiral Vashi's tentacles writhed in what could only be described as aquatic chuckling. Oh, Professor, wheezed General Krathnog from his specialized atmospheric bubble, surely you jest. Those tiny, soft creatures, with their pathetic single hearts and laughably slow reflexes? Quartermaster A, whose species communicated primarily through color changes, was cycling through what could only be described as the spectrum of ridicule. Zylken raised all 4 of his arms, waiting for the laughter to subside. His 3 eyes narrowed, and something that might have been a smile crossed his alien features. But it was not a pleasant smile. No, not pleasant at all. Yes, I know, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm so thick it could have been bottled and sold as a condiment. Look at them. So adorable with their tiny teeth. So harmless with their soft, unarmored skin. So weak with their pathetic inability to regenerate lost limbs. More chuckling rippled through the crowd. And, oh. Zylken continued, warming to his theme, let us not forget their absolutely precious single stomach. One stomach. Can you believe it? Not like our sophisticated multiple digestive systems. And their eyes. Only 2 of them. Forward-facing. Clearly the mark of a prey species, not a predator. Brandon Torres, sitting inconspicuously in the back row, exchanged a glance with Amy Kowalski beside him. Both humans remained perfectly still, their faces showing nothing but polite academic interest. But here is where things get interesting, Zylken said, his tone beginning to shift ever so slightly. The laughter was starting to die down as something in his voice suggested this was not going to be the comedy lecture they had expected. You see, my dear colleagues, I have spent the last 50 years studying these harmless creatures. I have analyzed their biology, their psychology, their history, and their behavioral patterns, and what I have found. He paused, letting his 3 eyes sweep across the now quiet auditorium, has kept me awake for the past decade. The silence was no longer filled with suppressed laughter. Something had changed in the professor's tone. Something that made even the most confident predator species in the audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. Today, I am going to explain to you exactly why every single intelligence agency in this galaxy should be absolutely terrified of the species we just welcomed into our Galactic Council with open arms. And with that, Professor Zylken clicked his presentation remote, and the first holographic display materialized above the stage. The hologram showed a standard human male, rotating slowly in three-dimensional display. The audience looked up expectantly, still wearing expressions of amused skepticism. Behold! Zylken announced with theatrical flair, gesturing at the projection with two of his arms while the other two operated his controls. The terrifying human physique. Look at this absolute unit of destruction. More snickers rippled through the crowd. Moran clicked her mandibles in what was clearly alien amusement. No claws. Zylken pointed dramatically. Absolutely none. Their digits end in these pathetic, soft appendages they call fingernails, clearly useless for any serious combat. No fangs, he continued, zooming in on the human's mouth. Just these ridiculously flat teeth, obviously designed for grinding plant matter. And look at those canines, if you can even call them that. I have seen more threatening dental work on herbivorous grazers. Quartermaster was cycling through colors that unmistakably indicated hilarity. No armor plating. Zylken's voice rose to mock dramatic heights. No natural protective shell. No chitinous exoskeleton. Just this soft, pink, vulnerable flesh covered by a thin layer of skin that can be pierced by their own wooden splinters. Even Commander Tom Malley was struggling to suppress what might have been a reptilian chuckle. In venom. Zylken threw all four arms up in exaggerated despair. Do they have venom? Of course not. No poison glands. No toxic secretions. They cannot even change colors to warn predators away. They are basically walking, talking prey animals. But then, something shifted in Professor Zylken's tone. His three eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a more serious register. But here, my dear colleagues, is where the nightmare begins. The hologram changed, now showing a human figure running across a vast plain. The timestamp in the corner began accelerating, showing hours passing. You see, what humans lack in natural weapons, they make up for with something far, far worse. They are persistence predators. Admiral Vashi's tentacles stopped writhing with amusement. His species knew about persistence predation. They had been on the receiving end of it from their planet's apex predators. Watch this, Zylken continued, his voice now carrying an edge of genuine unease. A human hunter spots his prey. Let us say, for argument's sake, it is one of Morden's ancestors. A large, powerful creature with natural armor and razor-sharp claws. The hologram now showed a primitive human pursuing what looked like a crystalline beast across rolling hills. The human does not try to catch the creature immediately. Oh no, that would be far too simple, far too merciful. Instead, the human simply follows, being at a steady pace. Not fast enough to catch the prey quickly, but fast enough that the prey cannot rest. The audience was becoming quieter. The mathematical implications were starting to sink in. Hour after hour, Zylken continued, his voice gaining momentum. Day after day. The prey runs until its muscles scream. It hides until the human appears on the horizon again. It rests until those terrible rhythmic footsteps resume behind it. Admiral Drehorn shifted his massive rocky frame uncomfortably. His species had never encountered persistence predators on their homeworld. And the most horrifying part? Zylken's voice was now completely devoid of humor. The human never stops. It does not need to rest for long periods like most predators. It does not give up when the prey escapes temporarily. It simply continues. The hologram showed the crystalline creature finally collapsing from exhaustion, while the human, barely winded, approached with a primitive spear. Humans can run for days, Zylken said flatly. Literal days. Without stopping. Their entire cardiovascular system is designed around sustained aerobic activity. They are biological pursuit engines. Judge Quintara's horn-like protrusions were no longer twitching with amusement. They were rigid with what could only be described as concern. But surely, called out General Kraftnog from his atmospheric bubble, their soft bodies make them vulnerable. One good injury, and they are finished. Zylken's three eyes focused on the general with something approaching pity. Oh, my dear general. Sweet, innocent general. You want to talk about human injury tolerance? The hologram changed again, now showing medical scans and injury reports. Humans regularly survive injuries that would kill most species instantly. They have been documented continuing to fight with severed arteries. They have been known to walk for miles with broken bones. There are records of humans completing athletic competitions with stress fractures in their limbs. The audience was completely silent now. They treat compound fractures as minor inconveniences, Zylken continued, his voice thick with disbelief. They have a saying, rub some dirt on it. They literally apply soil to wounds and continue with their activities. Admiral Vashi and Admiral Drohorn exchanged what could only be described as deeply worried glances. And here is the truly disturbing part, Zylken said, leaning forward conspiratorially. When humans are injured, they do not become more cautious. They become angry. Injury does not make them retreat. It makes them more dangerous. The hologram showed historical footage of human warriors continuing to fight despite horrific wounds. Their pain tolerance is not just unusual, Zylken concluded grimly. It is utterly alien to anything we understand about biological self-preservation. They can ignore signals that would drop any of us into immediate unconsciousness. He paused, scanning the now silent auditorium, and we have not even begun to discuss their mental capabilities. Professor Zylken wiped perspiration from his brow with his third arm while advancing his presentation. His usual academic confidence was beginning to crack around the edges, like paint peeling from a wall under intense heat. Now we enter the truly disturbing territory, he announced, his voice carrying a slight tremor. Human cognitive abilities and social structures. Or, as I have come to call it in my research notes, how to turn everything into a weapon, a species-wide mental disorder. The hologram shifted to display a human brain, rotating slowly with various regions highlighted in different colors. Observed their pattern recognition capabilities, Zylken continued, pointing at the frontal cortex with a slightly shaking appendage. Humans can identify threats, opportunities, and tactical advantages from impossibly small data sets. They see patterns where other species see random chaos. He clicked to the next slide, showing human hunters coordinating a complex ambush. But here is where it gets genuinely frightening. They do not hunt alone. Oh no! That would be far too simple for these terrifying little creatures. They hunt in coordinated groups with communication systems so sophisticated that they can execute complex strategies without any direct neural linking. Commander Tom Malley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His species relied heavily on telepathic coordination for group activities. Watch this, Zylken said, his voice dropping to what was almost a whisper. The hologram showed a group of primitive humans surrounding a massive predator, using nothing but hand signals and vocalizations to coordinate their attack. No hive mind, no telepathic network, no chemical pheromone communication, just talking. And somehow, impossibly, they achieve perfect tactical coordination that would make our most advanced military units jealous. Admiral Vashi's tentacles had stopped moving entirely. In his species, such coordination required direct neural interface and their tool use. Zylken's voice was rising again, but now with barely contained panic rather than theatrical flair. Every single object in their environment becomes a potential weapon. Rocks become hammers. Sticks become spears. Fire becomes a weapon. Water becomes a weapon. Even air becomes a weapon. Judge Quintara leaned forward, her horn-like protrusions now angled with sharp attention. Surely you exaggerate, Professor. Air as a weapon? Zylken's three eyes fixed on her with an expression of absolute seriousness. They have weaponized atmospheric pressure differentials. They call them guns. They use controlled explosions to accelerate small projectiles at velocities that can penetrate most natural armor. And they do this casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the galaxy. The hologram now showed the evolution of human weaponry, from sharp sticks to increasingly sophisticated firearms. But the truly nightmare-inducing aspect, Zylken continued, his voice now unmistakably shaking, is their ability to improve and adapt their tools at an exponential rate. What takes other species millennia to develop, humans accomplish in decades. Quartermaster was no longer cycling through amused colors. The alien's chromatic display had settled into what could only be described as deep concern mixed with growing alarm. However, Professor Zylken said, pausing dramatically while his three eyes swept the now silent auditorium, their individual capabilities pale in comparison to their social warfare tactics. Commander Tom Mali was looking distinctly uncomfortable now, his scaled hide showing stress patterns that were visible even to other species. Humans do not simply form alliances, Zylken explained, his tone becoming almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather rather than galactic-level strategic threats. They seduce other species into dependency relationships. The hologram shifted to show historical human interactions with various alien civilizations. Observe their pattern. First contact, hello. We come in peace. We just want to trade. How adorable, yes? How innocent. Several audience members nodded, remembering their own first contact protocols. Second phase, look at these wonderful technologies we can share. Look at these cultural exchanges we can enjoy. Let us establish permanent diplomatic relationships, still charming, still seemingly beneficial to all parties. Admiral Drohorn's rocky features were settling into what might have been a frown, though it was difficult to tell with his species. Third phase, Zylken continued, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm, economic integration. Why do you need to maintain your own industrial base when we can provide everything so much more efficiently? Why struggle with these complex technologies when we have already solved these problems? The audience was beginning to murmur among themselves, uncomfortable recognition dawning on several faces. And then, Zylken said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, Phase 4. The target species realizes they can no longer function without human technology, human trade networks, human economic systems. They have become dependent. Moran's mandible clicking had become rapid and agitated. Her species had experienced something similar with their historical expansion. But surely General Kraftnog interjected from his atmospheric bubble, his voice carrying forced optimism, this is simply standard economic development. Many species follow similar patterns. Zylken's laugh was not pleasant. It was the sound an academic makes when confronting willful ignorance. Oh, my dear General, you sweet, naive creature. What you describe is indeed standard economic integration. What humans do is fundamentally different. The hologram changed to show complex diplomatic and economic networks with humans at multiple central nodes. Humans do not just create trade relationships. They create irreversible dependency webs. And here is the truly diabolical part. They make their targets grateful for the privilege. He clicked to the next display, showing approval ratings of human involvement in various alien civilizations. Look at these statistics. Species that have been completely economically absorbed by human systems rate their satisfaction with human partnership at over 90%. They love their own subjugation. Commander Tom Mali was now visibly sweating, a fact that did not go unnoticed by several nearby attendees. And the most terrifying aspect of all, Zylken concluded, his three eyes now wide with what could only be described as existential dread, is that I am not entirely certain this process is even conscious on their part. They might genuinely believe they are being helpful. The auditorium had fallen into complete silence. The kind of silence that follows the realization that everything you thought you knew about the universe has just been fundamentally challenged. Professor Zylken took a deep breath, his three eyes blinking in sequence as he tried to regain some semblance of his former academic composure. It was not working. His hands were visibly trembling as he advanced to the next holographic display. But wait, he said, his voice cracking slightly, there is more. Oh, so much more. Because what I have described so far assumes humans remain in their natural environment. What happens when they do not is, he paused, swallowing hard, absolutely nightmarish. The hologram shifted to show various planetary environments, frozen wastelands, scorching deserts, toxic atmospheric compositions, crushing gravitational fields, humans. Why? Zylken announced with the tone of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Are the most adaptable species we have ever encountered. And I do not mean adaptable in the sense of they can adjust their behavior. I mean adaptable in the sense of they can survive in environments that would kill us in minutes and somehow find ways to thrive there. Judge Quintara's horn-like protrusions were now rigid with attention. Professor, surely you cannot mean literal adaptation. Most species require millions of years to develop environmental tolerances. Zylken's laugh was hollow, echoing strangely in the now silent auditorium. Oh, Judge Quintara, sweet, logical Judge Quintara, humans do not wait for biological evolution. They simply change their environment to suit their needs, or change themselves to suit the environment, whichever is more convenient at the time. The hologram showed human settlements in environments that should have been uninhabitable, underwater cities, orbital stations, colonies on planets with lethal atmospheric compositions. They have colonized frozen wastelands where the temperature would flash freeze most of our bodily fluids, Zylken continued, his voice gaining a manic edge. They have built thriving cities in deserts hot enough to melt our exoskeletons. They live comfortably in atmospheric pressure that would crush most of our species into paste. Quartermaster had begun taking notes frantically, his color-changing skin cycling through rapid patterns of alarm and fascination, and their technological progression. Zylken's voice was rising again, but this time with barely controlled hysteria. Do you want to know how long it took humans to go from hitting things with sticks to building faster-than-light starships? Admiral Drehorn rumbled uncomfortably. His species had required nearly 50,000 years for similar technological development. 12,000 years. Zylken shouted, throwing all four arms up in despair. 12,000 years. My species has been using the same basic technology for longer than humans have had written language. We have pottery older than their entire civilization. The audience was now murmuring with genuine alarm. These timescales were not just impressive, they were terrifying. But here is where it gets truly disturbing. Zylken continued, his three eyes darting around the room as if expecting humans to suddenly materialize from the shadows. Their population expansion rates and colonization patterns. Judge Quintara interrupted again, her voice tight with growing concern. Professor, what exactly are you implying about human reproduction? Zylken's expression was that of a being who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. Humans reproduce constantly, he said flatly. Not seasonally, not in response to resource abundance. Constantly. And their offspring reach reproductive maturity in roughly 20 of their years. Do you understand the mathematical implications? Quartermaster A's note-taking had become so frantic that his color patterns were now strobing in rapid, nauseating cycles. They have gone from a single planet to establishing colonies in 17 star systems in less than 2 centuries since achieving spaceflight, Zylken continued, and his voice taking on the tone of someone reading an obituary for galactic civilization. At current expansion rates, they will have a presence in every inhabitable system within our local galactic cluster within 500 years. Admiral Vashi's tentacles had coiled so tightly around his chair that the metal was beginning to deform. And here is the truly horrifying part about human adaptability, Zylken said, leaning forward conspiratorially. They do not just adapt to survive. They adapt to excel. And when they have nothing to adapt to, he paused dramatically, they create challenges for themselves. The hologram changed to show various human recreational activities, mountain climbing, deep-sea exploration, extreme sports, competitive fighting. Judge Quintara, you wanted to know about human behavior patterns? Let me tell you about human hobbies, Zylken said, his voice dripping with dark amusement. They voluntarily jump from aircraft for fun. They climb mountains that can kill them just to say they did it. They race vehicles at speeds that would liquefy most species upon impact. General Krafnogg's atmospheric bubble was fogging with what appeared to be stress-induced respiratory changes. They have turned warfare into entertainment. Zylken continued, his voice reaching fever pitch. They watch other humans engage in ritualized combat for amusement. They have sports where the objective is to cause brain trauma to your opponent. And they call this recreation. Judge Quintara was now leaning forward in her seat, her voice urgent. Professor, are you suggesting that humans are naturally violent? Zylken's three eyes focused on her with an expression of absolute certainty. Judge Quintara, I am suggesting that humans have weaponized boredom. When they have no external threats to adapt to, they create internal ones. They are a species that requires constant challenge to maintain psychological stability. The silence that followed was deafening. And now, Zylken whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast auditorium, they are here, in our galaxy, looking for new challenges. Professor Zylken's three eyes darted wildly around the auditorium as if he expected human soldiers to burst through the doors at any moment. His forearms were now shaking so violently that he could barely operate his presentation controls. But here, he said, his voice rising to near hysteria, here is the most terrifying revelation of all. Everything I have described to you, everything we have witnessed from human capabilities represents a species that has never been truly threatened. The hologram shifted to show peaceful human colonies, bustling with commerce and development. Think about this carefully, Zylken continued, his voice cracking with strain. All of these remarkable adaptations, all of this terrifying efficiency, all of these nightmare-inducing capabilities, they developed these traits while living in relative safety. Humans have never faced an existential threat from a superior species. Admiral Vashi's tentacles had gone completely rigid. In his species' evolutionary history, their most devastating capabilities had only emerged under extreme survival pressure. Do you want to know what happens when humans are actually threatened? Zylken asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the massive auditorium. I have studied their historical conflicts. When humans perceive a genuine threat to their survival, they do not simply adapt, they transcend. The hologram began showing human historical warfare, primitive battles escalating to increasingly sophisticated conflicts. Observe their escalation patterns, Zylken said, pointing with a trembling appendage. When threatened with conventional weapons, they develop superior conventional weapons. When threatened with chemical warfare, they develop deadlier chemical warfare. When threatened with nuclear weapons. He paused, swallowing hard. They developed weapons that could sterilize entire planets. Judge Quintara was now gripping her chair so tightly that stress fractures were appearing in the metal. And here is the truly horrifying part, Zylken continued, his voice gaining momentum like a runaway freight train. These escalations happened within decades of each threat emerging. Not centuries, not millennia. Decades. General Krafnogg's atmospheric bubble was now completely fogged with stress-induced exhalations. But surely, Commander Tom Mali interjected desperately, his scaled hide showing extreme distress patterns, surely they have limits. Surely there are boundaries to their adaptive capabilities. Zylken's laugh was the sound of sanity breaking. Limits? Boundaries? Commander, they have split atoms for energy. They have manipulated genetic codes like computer programs. They have built artificial intelligences that can outthink most biological species. And they did all of this while at peace. The professor's voice was now echoing strangely in the silent auditorium, as if the very architecture was holding its breath. So I ask you, Zylken said, his three eyes wide with existential terror, what happens when a species with unlimited adaptive potential, exponential technological growth, and a psychological need for constant challenge discovers that they are not alone in the universe? What happens when they realize there are other species that might pose a threat? At that moment, two figures stood up in the back row of the auditorium. Actually, said Brandon Torres, his voice carrying easily in the silent space, that is a really interesting question, Professor. Amy Kowalski smiled politely as she stood beside him. We have been wondering the same thing ourselves. The silence that followed was not just quiet. It was the complete absence of sound that occurs when an entire auditorium of beings simultaneously stops breathing. Professor Zylken's three eyes focused on the two humans with an expression of absolute horror. His forearms began trembling so violently that he had to grip the podium to remain upright. You, he whispered, his voice barely a croak. You have been here the entire time. Oh yes, Amy said cheerfully, her tone so casual it was somehow more terrifying than any threat could have been. We are exchange students, cultural anthropology majors. This lecture has been absolutely fascinating from our perspective. Brandon nodded enthusiastically. We had no idea other species found our behavioral patterns so distinctive. This has been incredibly educational. Zylken's legs gave out. He collapsed into his chair, his three eyes staring at the humans with the expression of a being watching the heat death of the universe. Educational, he repeated numbly. You have been studying us while we studied you. Well, Amy said with that same terrifyingly pleasant tone, how else would we learn about galactic civilizations? Your academic institutions are really quite impressive. At that moment, General Kraftnog's voice boomed from his atmospheric bubble, though it carried a strange tone of forced cheer. Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary consciousness entities, he announced, I have just received word from the Galactic Council. By unanimous vote, the human species has been accepted as full members of our galactic community. The applause that followed was polite, measured, and absolutely terrified. Brandon and Amy clapped along enthusiastically, their applause somehow the loudest sound in the auditorium, despite being perfectly normal in volume. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, Professor Zylken, Amy called out cheerfully. We will definitely be sharing this with our cultural analysis department. They are going to find your research absolutely fascinating. Brandon added with genuine enthusiasm. Professor Zylken made a sound that might have been a whimper, might have been a sob, or might have been the last gasp of his sanity. His three eyes rolled back, and he toppled sideways off his chair, unconscious before he hit the floor. The two humans continued applauding politely as medical personnel rushed to assist the fallen professor. Humans. Admiral Vashi whispered to Admiral Drohorn, his tentacles coiled so tightly they had lost circulation. They have been studying us this entire time. Yes, Admiral Drohorn rumbled back, his rocky voice carrying undertones of deep unease. And now they are part of the council. The applause continued, punctuated only by the soft sound of Professor Zylken being loaded onto a medical transport, yet still unconscious, and muttering incoherently about persistence, predators, and weaponized friendship. Welcome to the galactic community, humanity.